Hello, I'm Salty Duchess, and today I'd like to answer the question, what is exciting about the Shadowdark tabletop role-playing game? I keep trying to think of how exactly I would describe the Shadowdark TTRPG, and the analogy my mind just can't seem to get away from is to compare it to a wizened old woman. She's not flashy, her dressing is simple and utilitarian. She's not chatty, what she has to say is expressed with an eye towards precision and expediency. She's not bizarre, her presence is familiar and comforting. Her breasts are growing saggy with age, and it's time to stop with this terrible analogy. Exciting might not be the first word to come to mind after a setup like that, but there's tons to like about Shadowdark. It's streamlined, it's flexible, it's intuitive enough that you shouldn't need to reference the book too often during play, but the layout and the organization is so top-notch that it is easy to reference during play. Which is good because no matter how many times I try to tell myself it's better to just make a ruling and look up the actual rule after the session, I still find myself absolutely compelled to look it up. It has a strong vision of what it wants to be, and the mechanics reinforce the game's vision of itself. It also draws its DNA from D&D of old, making it largely compatible with an absolute ocean of previously published materials. But does it lean on this ubiquitous DNA a little bit too much? Let's start with why I'm calling it streamlined, flexible, and intuitive. Just take a look at some of these rules sections yourself. Bold headers followed by often just 1 to 2 small paragraphs covering everything you need in nice-sized text. Subsections are outlined with numbered lists, bulleted lists, or bold subsections, whatever makes sense for the context. It's so easy to find what you're looking for at a quick glance when the book is laid out like this. Paradoxically, it's actually a lot easier to poorly communicate an idea using lots of words rather than effectively communicating an idea using fewer words. Take a look at some of these other books covering similar topics to the ones we just looked at in Shadowdark. By comparison, reading these layouts feels like I'm being punished for not meeting the minimum word count on an English essay. Minimum word counts, by the way, are a damn lazy rubric for writing, and I'm glad Kelsey, the writer and designer of this book, didn't use that style of writing. Minimum word counts punish effective communicators, and worse, they reward ineffective communicators. Thank you to those English teachers for every muddy, rambling business email you've ever received. Admittedly, there were a couple of spots where I actually would have liked a few more words and some extra clarity. I did look up online for more details about how exactly gaining XP worked in the system as written and when XP was awarded for some additional clarity beyond what was written in the book. It is a fun system though. Characters get XP by looting valuables and managing to return to town with them. Then they have the opportunity to sell those values and then decide how much to convert into gear versus converting it into XP by choosing to carouse. Like a baker finishing a donut, I don't want to glaze over carousing too quickly. Offering XP for gold in this way not only makes gold still feel valuable even when a character has all the basic gear they need, but especially with some of the higher results, it can grant not just XP, but engaging narrative rewards and consequences. Luckily, the carousing table isn't too realistic, otherwise 80% of the rewards would just be 0 XP and various flavors of regret. We also had to look up if focusing on a spell to keep a spell you had already cast continuing on subsequent turns was an action or not. It wasn't, and you can even cast other spells as long as they aren't also a focus spell, which is pretty strong. I appreciate that there's an active community in this game to be able to talk about such questions as they arise. The creator herself is often seen in Reddit threads clarifying questions and engaging with the community, and sure, by reading the book closely and being more willing to just make judgment calls, aka being literate and growing a spine, I would have been fine. But it's just in my nature to want to understand the intent of a system before intentionally or unintentionally modifying it. Oh, and one quick complaint about the clarity of the system, though. The ranges are called close, near, and far. Really? Close versus near? Are these not basically perfect synonyms to everybody else? Am I the crazy one here? I had to look it up again just to make sure I'd get it right for the review. Root uses a 3-step range system as well, but their vernacular is intimate, close, and far, significantly more clear to me than close, near, and far. The system is both flexible and intuitive, like a contortionist with a high EQ for largely the same reason. The rules are simple, and the core mechanic is simple and immediately familiar to everyone in the hobby, except for those precious few locked in Alaskan basements with no internet, armed only with well-worn print-on-demand copies of GURPS. If an action is uncertain, roll a d20, add a relevant stat modifier, and compare against a Game Master-determined difficulty class. If your result is equal to or over the DC, the action succeeds. Have you ever thought you wanted something but turned out you didn't? I had one of those moments with this game. Here are the rules for overland travel. I read these and thought, wow, these are such a good base. Nice and simple, easy to expand upon, but I want some extra meat. Let's find some rules to expound on this. But I realized not long into that process that I was like a toddler demanding a tomahawk steak. More isn't always better, and I settled with keeping the simple, easy to use, and reference travel rules as they are for now. If I change my mind, this simple framework still awaits any tweaks or adjustments that I might desire in the future. Okay, so earlier I mentioned this game has a strong vision of what it wants to be, and that the rules support that. So what exactly is it going for? It's going for a deadly and fast fantasy adventure. Fantasy adventure is the easy part of that. The gear, the random tables, the spells, the monsters, they are all familiar and reinforce the fantasy adventure theme. So what about deadly? That's easily done. Characters have very little health, and monsters do plenty of damage. Even level 1 monsters could easily down first level adventurers with a normal hit, let alone if they manage to land a crit. Especially for low level adventurers, they're going to want to find a way to get the upper hand in fights or risk the consequences. The fact that someone could go down with almost any roll of the dice makes combat very tense. You might find yourself tempted to pull your punches a little bit as the GM, especially if your players aren't used to a combat system that's quite like this. I would encourage you to keep popping their characters like fruit gushers, and eventually you will, hopefully, see their playstyle shift away from just bravely taking every straight-up fight at every opportunity. If someone hits 0 or fewer HP, they go unconscious and will die in 1d4 plus their Constitution modifier rounds. The minimum number of rounds is still 1, but this makes choosing Constitution as a dump stat even crazier. If left to their own devices, the player rolls a d20 on each round their character would have normally acted. Hitting a nat 20 gets them back up on their feet with 1 HP. Otherwise, they will die. A downed character, though, can be healed or stabilized to prevent death. It's certainly quite deadly by 5e standards, which I imagine is the benchmark for a lot of people, but by my standards, it's actually not too bad. I've become quite fond of systems where characters whose HP value goes below 0 into a negative value is automatically dead. It's a little bit macabre, but I just love getting to narrate truly brutal, definitive deaths of a player character if they're going to die. Some twisted part of me is kinda bummed out when a PC is downed and I need to keep it believable that there's even a chance they might be able to recover. I get that I could narrate a death blow if that character does truly die in the subsequent rounds, but sometimes that's just a little narratively awkward, or maybe I'm just a sicko. The fact that magic is unreliable helps make the system deadlier too. When you cast a spell, you make a check, adding your intelligence or wisdom modifier depending on the type of spell against a DC of 10 plus the tier of the spell. On a success, the spell goes off, and on a failure, you can't attempt to cast that spell until you rest. There's no limit on the successes though, which is pretty cool. If you're particularly adept at casting a spell, you might get to use it over and over again all day long. Critical failures introduce a lot of risk to spell casting though, particularly for wizards. See, if a priest critically fails their spellcasting check, now they won't be able to cast the spell until they pay some kind of penance. A holy quest, a ritual, or a sacrifice to appease their god who has taken away their spell like a greedy little toddler taking a toy someone else was playing with. But if a wizard critically fails their spellcasting check, well, they might damage themselves, damage an ally, or even both. It's randomly determined, and there are worse effects the higher level of spell the wizard was attempting to cast. A small detail that helps keep the game deadly is that your Constitution modifier only adds HP on your first level. Good news for the Constitution dump stat crew, and bad news for the fighters out there, but either way, it helps keep health pools from ballooning out of control. Something that maybe helps reduce the deadliness in this game actually, but something I still wanted to call out specifically is the help with rough guidelines around encounter balance in the game. No, this does not mean every group of monsters should be solved with combat. No, not every encounter should be balanced in the party's favor. And no, this does not mean that every random encounter should utilize this math. I'm saying all this because, if you don't know, this game is part of a larger movement called the OSR, or Old School Renaissance/Revival, and to a decent chunk of this community, the phrase combat of average difficulty is a violent offense worthy of a generational blood feud, partly because they believe providing a little combat guidance will lead people away from their carefully crafted, correct mindset. It's an absolute load of bullshit if you ask me. If you've played a lot of OSR type games before, you'll have a rough idea in your head of how difficult a fight might be if faced head on because of your experience. All these tables do, in my opinion, is help make the game more accessible instead of keeping such knowledge locked inside the heads of the community. And if you don't want them, you can just choose not to use them. Much like the creator of this system though, I might have to go into hiding once this video is released. Another important dynamic this game is trying to lean into is making resource management matter. The two biggest ways this is done is by severely limiting equipment slots and by making light sources actually important. I think it's fun to mention really quick that equipment slots are actually so limited that this fighter ability here that adds their constitution modifier to their total available gear slots was both celebrated by the player who picked a fighter and slightly envied by someone who was playing a spellcaster. If that doesn't say this game makes gear slots feel valuable, I'm not sure what does. It's not that hard to make enough room for necessary equipment when delving into the Shadowdark, but it's the fact that most treasure also takes up gear slots that makes for really hard decisions. The dark in Shadowdark is emphasized by three things. A, player characters cannot see in the dark no matter what ancestry they are. 2, magic is unreliable and dangerous, so a spellcaster spamming the light spell might not be so reliable. And finally, light sources last for 1 hour of real time. That last part also helps keep the game moving along. No one wants to sit around and spend 5 to 10 minutes debating the correct way to open a door when your precious light source is being eaten away in real time. This last bit about Shadowdark I'm going to bring up is very significant, but it's not really my area of expertise, to be honest. Shadowdark inherits much of its DNA from the Dungeons & Dragons of old. I've shown some of this already with its familiar mechanics, but perhaps most meaningful is the fact that Shadowdark is going to be roughly compatible with an absolute ton of content, from old classic modules to various new and exciting offerings that are coming out as part of the old school revival/renaissance. If you want some deep dive analysis on how Shadowdark fits into the greater OSR movement and how it stacks up against similar systems, I just don't have that for you. Maybe I'll play enough of these systems one day to have my own strong opinion about it. But on this subject, I did pose the question earlier, does it lean on this familiar DNA a bit too heavily? I had this thought because of just how condensed the rules are. I think they're great, but I got to wondering, what if I was brand new to tabletop role-playing games? Would these condensed rules work well for that situation as well as they work for me, someone who is already relatively familiar with all this stuff? I'll never know for sure without one of those memory wipey sticks from Men in Black, but I do think ultimately it probably doesn't matter all that much. Firstly, the community for this game is really active and relatively welcoming, and secondly, the book still has its fair share of advice for running games, examples of play, and random tables to help kick things off if needed. So I don't know for sure if the rules condensing has gone a little too far for new players or not, but I do know I appreciate the book for what it is. Final thoughts on my first impressions of Shadowdark here after a few sessions with friends. I understand the question that I pose in these reviews is what is exciting about the Shadowdark tabletop role-playing game, but is it a cop-out to say I actually don't really find this book exciting? It's solid. I had a 5e campaign that was still in the early stages. I wanted to play something familiar to the players, but something that was a bit more streamlined and easier to prep, and Shadowdark was a perfect, solid fit for that purpose. I'll probably keep using it for that campaign too for however long it ends up lasting. But this wasn't something where I came to one of the groups I play with and was like, damn, we need to check out this game ASAP. Look at all the incredibly cool stuff going on. It was more like we just wanted to play something that felt like D&D. I wanted as the GM something that was going to be easy to use, learn, and potentially modify, and Shadowdark was just a solid choice for our needs. Thanks for your time. Bye.